All right, let's begin by talking about the report which has been put out by the Intergovernment Panel for Climate Change, a body backed by the United Nations. So it's over a 3,000-page report. More than 200 scientists from across the world have worked on it. Here's what they've found, largely speaking. Number one, it's now without doubt clear that temperatures have warmed over the last century because of the actions of human beings, which is essentially burning more fossil fuel, leading to greater emissions, leading to warmer temperatures across the world. Because of this, the ongoing emissions of greenhouse gases are very likely to breach the target the world set for itself in the Paris Climate Accord. The plan was that we don't allow the Earth to warm more than 2% by the year 2100. Well, we're set to breach that before 2040. That's how far we've gone. This is going to result in a lot of things happening, including a rise in sea levels by up to 2 meters by the end of the century. That cannot be ruled out. Because of this, we are going to be seeing irreversible changes for centuries. So there'll be heat waves, humid heat stress will be more intense and frequent. In India, there will be irreversible impact due to glacier retreat in Hindu Kush Himalayas, erratic monsoons, which we're already beginning to see. The Indian Ocean warming will be at a higher rate than for other oceans. Only deep cuts in emissions of greenhouse gases can stabilize rising temperatures. So what are we going to do about it? That's the question that we're asking on the show today. And joining me are Avantika Goswami. She is the Deputy Program Manager at CSE. Chandra Bhushan, he's Environmentalist and CEO, iFOREST. Damandeep Singh of the Carbon Disclosure Project India, also on the show with us. Welcome to all of you and thank you so much for speaking with us. Mr. Chandra Bhushan, let me begin by asking you, how significant is this report at a time when we're actually seeing the impact of this around the world? The latest in the series are the fires blazing in Greece, in Turkey. Before that, we saw floods in Germany. And India has been seeing major climate change related events over the last many years, isn't it?
Absolutely, Tamanna. This report is extremely important, especially when the world is experiencing extreme weather events. From communication perspective, this is a perfect time to tell the world what we are doing as far as climate crisis is concerned. As you rightly said, Greece is battling with wildfire. Italy had huge wildfire. There is record level of wildfire happening in California. Western part of India went through landslide and extreme floods. Our monsoon is variable. We do not need more evidence than what we are experiencing today as far as climate crisis is concerned. And this report now establishes firmly, and at one level, this report is no different than the previous IPCC report. The only difference is that the level of certainty and confidence with which scientists have written this report has increased many folds. And scientists are now clear that our world is warming at a much rapid rate than that was predicted before. And therefore, we will hit 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase well before 2040. And if we don't do anything, we will hit 2 degrees Celsius temperature increase between 2040 to 2060. So they are telling us that, look, we had predicted something 5-6 years back. We are sorry. Things are far worse. This is what this report is about. And there is no good news for India in this report. In fact, everything about India is a bad news. We are going to get hit. We are going to get hit sooner and in more intense fashion than previously. In fact, in a decade or two, extreme weather events of today will seem like a cakewalk. That is what is likely to happen. So all in all, an extremely important report, a clarion call, and for us and for everyone else in the world.
The scary part is that all of this is broadly known. There are no major surprises from the point of view of, we know because of human behavior, emissions have been going up, the world is warming. And yet when we talk about action, Damandeep Singh, let me come to you over here. We had a Paris Climate Accord, which major countries, over 50 countries of the world signed and agreed to. Clearly, all of that talk, every year we hear big talk from leaders across the world who have probably used a jet to go to the location where they're talking about it, and they talk about reducing the impact of climate change. Why do you think it's not working? Are efforts being taken so far too little or not serious enough?
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks for inviting me to your show again. Yeah, so actually, efforts have been happening, but they are way too slow and far too incremental. They're not exponential. They're not adding up. So since Paris, we've seen some movement. We set up a program called Science-Based Targets, I remember, at Paris. And everybody thought, what an inelegant name, science-based. But that became a clarion call when Mr. Trump was the president of the United States and so on, because of the unscientific approach. So what IPCC tells us with increased scientific certainty that this is going to happen. And we've been working with companies to ask them to take science-based targets. That means they need to, when the governments are actually, what we find, policies working far slower than action by some of the companies. Some of the companies have gone far ahead and have actually taken individual actions to align themselves to a net zero target by 2050. The governments, and Indian government is one of the few governments that is not yet committed to a target, and we can come to that if there is need to do that. There is action that's happening, but it's not happening at a scale that's required. Companies are telling us that we can only do so much in the absence of any policy drivers. We have found 58 companies now have a internal carbon price, wherein they're taxing themselves and keeping that revenue for their green initiatives. But those are insignificant, $5, $7 equivalent. What they're saying is, in the absence of any policy, we can only experiment with so much. Once there is a policy signal, they will see a lot more action happening. So, then other civil society organizations that are working with cities are coming in play. There is now talk of science-based targets for cities actions. There is now talk of science-based targets on water. So what is it that will be action that's appropriate? Saying that you're planting a few lakh trees is not going to be enough. We know Mr. Mukesh Ambani has taken a carbon neutral target by 2035, but we don't know the details. We can't examine that. We can't question that. We have the details from Geo, but we don't have the details from Reliance.
Avantika, I want to understand very clearly what needs to be done. I know it seems like a very simple question, so let me not start at the governmental level. Let me start at a civic level, at an individual level. What do we need to stop doing today to at least mitigate some of the impact of what we are certain to see in the next 15 to 20 years?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Tamanna. And honestly, there's quite a big debate around, whether we should be focusing on individual action to drive a problem that has been caused by forces that are much larger, that are actually systemic. So should we be asking people to swap out their plastic straws for metal straws or paper straws when, you have massive fossil fuel companies who are responsible for a majority of global fossil CO2 emissions today? So that's quite a lively debate that goes on. And it's not to say that at the individual level, our consumption habits should continue to be reckless. We should continue to pollute rivers and oceans and whatnot. But I think there is quite a lot of disproportionate focus on that, as opposed to really holding major polluters accountable. So that's one aspect of that debate. I do feel, however, individual action, when summed up at a collective level, that can really spur things that are valuable for the climate movement around the world. If you've seen the strikes by school children around the world, led by figureheads like Greta Thunberg, you have indigenous activists and activists from the global south who have lent their voice to the climate debate and have actually, pushed through various measures over the years. So it's a question of individual actions coming together to become collective actions, I think that would be valuable for sure. One thing that can definitely be done.
But Avantika, I just want to rewind a little bit. I just want to rewind a little bit and go to the point you made, and I think that's a very valid point. Should individuals, and especially this is a question which a country like India, which is a developing nation, faces, should we now start cutting carbon emissions when, on an average, our consumers use very little because of the kind of country we are? So should people, for example, who've just about got the opportunity to use an air conditioner, now stop using it, or stop taking flights when most of the country still needs to grow in aviation? But you talked about large producers of emission and the large culprits. Do you think they're not being brought to book fast enough?
They're absolutely not being held accountable fast enough. There is some momentum happening on this front. I think last month or month before last, companies like Shell was taken to court in the Netherlands over its historic contributions to climate change. ExxonMobil's own shareholders revolted and talked about bringing in greater sustainability concerns into Exxon's operations. But for countries like India, particularly in the global south, you're right, our per capita emissions, firstly, our emissions as a country as a whole are minuscule. Between 1870 and 2019, India's contributions to global CO2 emissions, purely fossil fuel emissions, have been 3%. If you look at countries like the United States, they've contributed about a quarter, almost 25% of CO2 emissions since the industrial period, which is about 1870 or so. Currently, annually, the US and China together contribute almost 50% of annual CO2 emissions. So there's a lot of variation, not just across countries, but also across income levels. You're right, you have rich leaders jetting off in their private jets to so-called climate conferences, but you have the poor in our country unable to access basic energy or fulfill their basic needs. So why are we looking at the poor of India and other countries in the global south and pointing fingers at them? So definitely the focus should be less on reducing per capita emissions in developing countries even further. And the focus should be more on reducing per capita emissions in rich countries. As well as reducing consumption emissions of the rich.
You know, that's the debate that's the debate which has, in a sense, strangled any real movement on, you know, cutting down emissions for several years. It's a very pehle aap kind of a discussion where developed nations point to growing countries, and India among them, and say that, you know, cut your emissions fast. And we say, okay, give us the technology, but what about your average usages? Mr. Chandra Bhushan, do we still have the time to bicker about this? Do we need to now hit the panic button as a people, as one world, looking at what this report is telling us today?
I think we have done that for 30 years, and developed countries have brought this debate to a level where we do not have scope to continue this debate. You know, this debate was fine in 1990, 2000, when there was enough carbon space for everyone. In the last 30 years, China has now become the largest current global emitter and also one of the significant historical emitters. Okay. So I think strategically in global negotiation, we have failed as a country, as a developing country, simply because we kept harping about pehle aap, without understanding that a time will come where there will be no space for pehle aap. And we have reached that stage today. Today in 2020, even if India argues that I have less historical emission, I have less per capita, India doesn't have space to increase emissions significantly. We will have to cut emission over the next 2 to 3 decades if we want to save lives. At the end of the day, maximum people are going to suffer in country like India who have very less adaptive capacity. We have very, very less resilience. So the fact is, we now have to, see what is the gain in terms of doing this pehle aap, and gain in terms of building a global collaborative mechanism and taking leadership ourselves. We have an opportunity to take leadership in green industry.
Yeah.
Instead of thinking about industries of 20th and 19th century, that's what it is all about today. Coal and dirty technologies, which is polluting our air and water. Climate is secondary. Even in terms of our own environment, we are extremely polluted. So I think we have an opportunity to take leadership. Our industrial leaders have the opportunity to move towards 21st century green industry and build a new economy, which is good for environment and good for economy. I think that option exists today. Today, there is no contradiction between economic growth and green growth. We have all technology. Renewables are cheaper. I just saw your introductory news item. The biggest share market person is now investing in renewable energy. Okay. So even if government policies are backward, I think industry, private sector now realizes where the mouth is. And therefore, they are going to invest in renewable energy. They are going to invest in electric vehicle, battery storage, green steel, hydrogen. Daman talked about Reliance industry. The market has changed if Reliance thinks that its interest lies in carbon neutrality in next 15 years. I think that should be good enough sign. So government can be laggard, but I think
is it enough, Daman? Is it enough? Is it enough for private enterprise to take the lead? And it's a good thing. You've given the example of Reliance Industries at their last AGM. The big pivot was to green energies and building, capacities for, replacement of fossil fuels, etc. And that coming from Reliance is a big deal. As you mentioned, story that ET Now broke earlier in the day. Earlier this evening, Rakesh Jhunjhunwala is going to be investing a big stake in Syska LED. Damandeep, is it enough that private sector will move where it makes sense to them, that we have to move here? Is it enough to do that, or will policymakers have to now back this up and shrug off that lethargy?
Tamanna, the private sector is moving, and it's actually forcing some of the policymakers to make some changes. I'll just give you an example. I spoke to you about science-based targets. 4 years ago, when I went to discuss this in the ministry, I was almost thrown out by one of India's major bureaucrats saying that, we don't want to be prescriptive. And then in 2019, the minister, Mr. Javadekar, mentioned science-based targets in his UN speech. So, there is a inevitable momentum to these things, and things will have to happen and they will change. We spoke about Reliance. I mean, JSW, Mr. Sajjan Jindal's organization has also come up with similar targets, and they're doing phenomenal things. I'm very encouraged by the incremental changes, or rather the pivot that the Tata Group is taking, slowly but steadily. And in the interest of full disclosure, we have the MD of Tata Chemicals, Mr. Mukundan, on the India board of CDP and also as a global trustee. So there is, the private sector sees the light, because that's where they also need international finance. And the international investors are now asking for this information. We ran a campaign called Non-Disclosure Campaign, where actually investors are writing individual letters to companies saying, why aren't you disclosing your climate risk? We need this information. So they are individually targeting companies to do that. The real change, right? The big companies see the light, but the real change will happen when that percolates into their value chains, into their supply chains. This year's supply chain report, and we have 150 of the top corporates, including Walmart, L'Oreal, Dell, Coke, Pepsi, who are our members. And if you're a top tier supplier, you will get CDP questionnaire on their behalf and you will answer that. This year's supply chain report shows that there's actually 11 times of a company's emissions in their value chain, okay? And in some sectors like textile, it's 25% and so on, 25 times. 5-6 years ago, if I remember correctly, in 2015-16, this figure was 5.5 to, sorry, 6 times. So what it shows is actually, as big companies are becoming greener, they're probably pushing their high emitting sectors into their value chains. So we will need to work with the value chains. What was happening earlier amongst nations, where dirty industries were moving to the developing countries, now we find that actually the high emitting, it's quite possible, and this needs to be investigated, the high emitting portions of their activity are being shifted to their supply chains. how does one address that? And I think that is something that one talks about.
They're getting someone else to do it. They're getting someone else to do it because, they don't want to let go of this. I want to get Avantika's view on this. Avantika, all of this, praises being heaped on corporate sector around the world for being more environmentally conscious. Do you think there's enough actually being done, or is this now becoming a brand enhancement exercise in some cases?
I mean, there's a reason that greenwashing has been in the public domain as a term for a couple of decades now. So this is not to say that the corporate sector isn't moving. They're seeing the value of greening their operations, of investing in greater renewable energy, no doubt. But I think going back to one of your earlier questions, leaving this to the private sector, leaving the onus of addressing the climate crisis to the private sector, it's definitely misguided. You do need regulatory support, a regulatory environment created by the government, by the public sector, not just in India, but around the world, to push the kind of transformative change that we need. In India, currently, you're seeing loosening of the norms for SOx and NOx emissions by dirty power plants. You're seeing amending of the forest acts, which are making way for more clearing of forests for development. So there's plenty to be positive about, but there's also plenty to suggest that our industrial emissions are going to keep rising and are not going to be brought under control anytime soon. So from that perspective, greater role of the public sector as a facilitator of this transformative action, I think is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, unfortunately, that whole development versus environment debate still exists in large parts of our country. Let's look inwards to begin with. This is a problem all over the world, and China is the biggest emitter, as everyone knows. But if you look inwards, our top A-grade companies are changing, but the bulk of manufacturing still comes from small and medium businesses. Is this even a priority when they're just trying to survive? We'll have to answer those tough questions as well as we continue this debate. But for now, I want to thank all of you for joining us on what is a very important day to discuss something that will be our biggest story for the next several years.